All right. So let's get it straight into exploitative strategy. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We've got a quick presentation. We'll take a look at a hand, and hopefully this is beneficial and helpful for all of you guys. Okay, so what are we dealing with, and why does it matter? So the first thing to understand about exploitative strategy is that playing the same way that your metagame plays will guarantee that you lose the rake, and that's something that I don't think most poker players really think about or talk about or even understand necessarily. So we can do a quick thought experiment. I call it the 100 bot MTT example. So if we have 100 bots and they all have the exact same skill set, they all play the exact same way, and they play 1 million games, or 10 million games, it doesn't matter, just a lot of games, right? What's the EV of each bot? Well, it's the same, right? They all win the same amount of money. What if we charge each bot $1 to play? Right? If they play 1 million games, each bot would lose $1 million, right? If we charge each bot $1 for each game, they play 1 million games, then their EV would be minus $1 per game, or minus $1 million, right? If we charge them $10 to play, they would lose $10 million. Okay, so if you play the same way as everyone else, that's you. Okay, so if you play the exact same way as everyone else, you are going to lose the rake. And so what we need to do is we need to have a way of playing differently than the metagame. Now, there are two ways to approach that. One is to just play better, theoretically, and obviously the other way is to try to exploit your opponents. So which brings us to number 2, and that's that players do make mistakes. Okay, so supernormal or exploitative property opportunities do appear, and they can significantly increase your win rate. So I think it goes without saying, but people aren't bots. People play differently. People play badly. And if you can maximally take advantage of how those players are playing, there's a lot of opportunity there. Okay, understanding how to do this correctly can help you to counter-exploit someone who's targeting you. So, this is typically the lesser of the 3 issues, but certainly something to keep in mind. Okay, so this is going to be pretty much the meat of the presentation. This is going to take a little bit of time, and then after this, we're going to get into a hand where I give you an example of me taking advantage of this. So these are just rules of thumb, which means that they're going to be wrong sometimes. Okay, so these are not like ironclad exploitative rules. Other people's rules for exploitative strategy might differ from mine, but these are the things that I think are really important for kind of engaging and attacking people with exploits. So the first thing is to really have a deep-founded respect for your current strategy. Okay, so in my case, I study poker a lot. I study a lot of no-limit hold'em. Most of my studying involves, theoretical work, which I think a lot of people know, right? People know that I spend a lot of time with solvers, et cetera, et cetera. So I've spent a lot of time building and honing a good strategy. And really what a solver strategy is it's just a tested strategy, okay? So the strategies that emerge from solvers have been tested against the programs themselves, and they emerge as really strong, solid strategies. So you basically want to stick to that, and you don't want to deviate from it and then engage in a really crappy strategy unless you have a good reason to do it. Okay, so without sufficient reads, you really don't want to turn off or dismantle a really solid strategy. So the second thing is that the source of exploits are going to be the mistakes that your opponents make. This is also something that people, I think, fail to understand. If your opponents aren't making mistakes, you can't exploit them, right? So in our bot example, if they're all playing the same way, there's no exploits happening, right? So when we're trying to exploit our opponents, we're looking for mistakes in their strategy or deviations from what we would understand to be good play, right? So if someone opens 7-2 offsuit from under the gun, you might want to attack that player with 3 bets, but that's because you know that that's a bad play, right? And if that player opens king-queen suited from under the gun, and that's the only hand you see, you're not really going to exploit him for that. There's nothing you can do about it. I mean, that's a good open. There's no opportunity there, right? So when we're looking to engage in exploits, the source of our opportunities will be our opponent's mistakes, okay? And the mistakes are most likely to come from weaker players and not winning players. So if you have weaker players that are putting in a lot of volume, those are the types of players to pay attention to the most. Okay. Okay. So there are usually 3 main conditions under which I would deviate from my GTO or my more central strategy. And basically it happens when I have a really big sample size on someone, so I can become convinced that an opportunity exists because I have sufficient data. When I have a really deeply held conviction about the metagame and that the metagame is playing in a specific way, and I think that this way of playing applies to most people, and then I can try to exploit that. Or, like, and this is more common, an observation of something you understand to be incorrect, which we already talked about, and likely to be repeated, which is also something that people don't appreciate sometimes. Sometimes people want to exploit people because they're so eager to exploit. They try to do it so quickly. They don't really think about whether or not the behavior is likely to be repeated. So if your opponent's behavior is totally chaotic, then it can be, to some extent, a little bit more difficult to exploit someone. So, for example, if someone's going to open 7-2 offsuit from under the gun sometimes, but fold Jack-10 suited from under the gun sometimes, that gets a little bit more complicated. So you want, the more likely the behavior is to be repeated, the easier the exploit is, and the more you can kind of construct a strategy that's optimally going to take advantage of the way your opponents are playing. The best opportunities, obviously, might be combinations of those three, right? So ideally, we would have like a little bit of a sample size with like something that we've observed, with like an understanding that the metagame also plays this way. So like we're kind of like right in all of our key variables have all lined up, and then we can engage in the exploit. Okay. You want to recognize that the most studied scenarios, this is also where people, I think, make a lot of mistakes. The most studied scenarios, which would be pre-flop and the flop, in my opinion, are often the ones that are going to be the most difficult to exploit if you're in a tough metagame. Okay. So obviously, if you have a big sample, if you have a lot of data, they're easy situations to exploit. So if you have a HUD and, it tells you that, over 10,000 hands, this guy has played 80% of his buttons, you can attack his button opens. I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? If you see that he's got, a 90% fold to 3-bet, which it never happens, but if you saw that, you could attack him with 3-bets. But without a sufficient data set, it's difficult to say like the metagame is playing poorly pre-flop in this one scenario, on average, because that's the area that improves the most rapidly, right? So by definition, river scenarios will be a little bit easier to exploit than maybe pre-flop situations. Okay, so you also want to consider the third order consequences of exploiting someone, and you want to make sure that it's worth it. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you engage in a pre-flop exploit, that's going to have an impact on your strategy on the flop, turn, and river. So for example, if someone folds the 3-bets too much, so you attack him with a 3-bet and then he calls, well, now his range is really strong. So now you have to take that into consideration as you go through post-flop play, right? As if someone overfolds versus c-bets, okay, and so you c-bet with a wider range than maybe you're supposed to c-bet. Well, if you know how the turn is supposed to play ordinarily, now you don't, right? Because you have to readjust for the fact that you have a wider c-betting strategy on the turn. So you're getting to the turn with a different range than you were theoretically prepared for. So you have to make an adjustment for that, okay? So there are consequences of trying to exploit someone. Obviously, they could also counter-exploit you. You could also just be wrong about the exploit. So you want to make sure that, and you want to make sure that you understand the consequences fully and that you still want to do it. Rivers, capped ranges, scenarios where your opponent's range are either too dense in bluffs or too dense value. Okay, so that just means that they have too many bluffs per value bet, or too much value per bluff at the starting point of their range, or multi-way pots. Those are the scenarios that I consider ripe for exploitation. Okay, so those are the types of scenarios that I'm looking for. So obviously, when we're going over exploitative play, I think it's helpful if I tell you guys like what I'm actually looking for and what works for me. Those are the scenarios that I think are kind of the easiest ones to target. And then there's this general kind of mantra of attacking what's weak and retreating from what's strong. That's kind of just basic theory that applies to pretty much any kind of discipline you want to engage in. But what does that mean? Like, what is weak, right? And so what is weak and what is strong? Well, by weak, we typically associate that with bet sizing or prior straight action, okay? So if someone's checking, they're likely to be weak, right? If someone is betting really small, that's more likely to signal that they have a weaker range, okay? And retreating from what is strong, if someone's triple barreling and they overbet the flop, turn, and river, that suggests strength, right? So that's what I'm referring to in that instance in terms of the contrast there between weak and strong. Because I do think that people are like, oh, attack what's weak. And it's like, well, what the hell does that mean, right? Attack what's strong. Well, what the hell does that mean? If you're enjoying this video and you're looking for more just like it, you should head over to the BBZ Discord. I do sessions for free every single week. So head over to the BBZ Discord and just check those out. In addition to that, if you really like learning and studying No Limit Hold'em, we've got our seminars available at just $60 per month. And within those seminars, you're going to get access to a comprehensive pre-flop chart package, in addition to the full BBZ Poker library, which has over 1,000 videos in it at this point, always growing. And yeah, I just really look forward to seeing you there. So if you take No Limit Hold'em seriously and you're really looking to improve, 2 steps: join the BBZ Discord, and then head over to bbzpoker.com and join the seminars. Now, I'm just going to show you guys one hand. This is certainly a hand that's exploitative. This is not a play that I would have engaged in otherwise. So I'm just going to give you a quick example of what we're talking about, and hopefully this is at least a little bit helpful in terms of framing the conversation. So I overcall the big blind preflop with 8-4 suited, which I think is pretty standard, considering the stack depth of my opponent here. And we have a check range scenario on the flop. If you ran this through some kind of solver, it would certainly tell you to check range. So there's nothing going on here. I think this player is probably checking range as well. So really there's no opportunity that exists yet. Okay. So at this point in the hand, the small blind leads for 3/4 pot. And this is pretty interesting. I would assume that this is going to be a fairly polarized bet size for my opponent. And I think that it's important to understand what that actually means, because I think when people say polarized, a lot of people don't necessarily understand it. So I think this player's range should have bluffs and very strong value hands. That's basically what I mean. I don't think this range is likely to be merged. So I don't think this range is likely to be like very dense 5x. First of all, the small blind doesn't flat 5x combos very often. So I don't think that this is going to be a sizing choice that I don't think this is a line that's going to be taken by the metagame very often with 5x. I think the metagame is also too polarized relative to what solvers would recommend. Solvers recommend playing more merged betting strategies in multi-way pots, but metagames don't do that yet. So again, you can see that I'm leveraging information I have about how theoretical play should look. So I think this bet in practice is likely to be quite polarized. And so what I mean by that is like probably King X plus and probably good King X plus. 3/4 pot multi-way is likely to be like King Jack plus in my opinion. Very unlikely that I'm running into a dense component of Queen X. Very unlikely I'm running into a lot of 5x. 2x I think makes a lot of sense, but I don't think the metagame finds it very often. And then again, bluffs. Bluffs might be like Jack 10, Ace Jack, Ace 10. I think more likely to be Jack 10 or 10 9. Certainly flush draws make sense. Okay, so I think that this range is likely to be somewhat polar. I think most people would agree with me that this player doesn't have Queen 10 very often or Queen Jack very often. I think that as far as this range construction, or morphology, which is really what we're talking about. I think that this is morphology just refers to range construction. It's just another word. It's a synonym for range construction. Okay, in terms of poker. So I call, which I think is debatable potentially, but probably fine. This range is capped. Should be capped. This player checks back the flop, which should mean that this player is stripped of flopped sets and good King X, which means this range may be dense deuces, for example. That's a possibility. But deuces is actually one of the pairs that's likely to see bet the flop. So, especially deuces with a diamond. So I don't think that this range has very many strong hands at all in it. This player, at this point in the hand, we can go ahead and take a look at this player's profile. I have a very limited sample. I don't play that much No Limit Hold'em right now. So I don't engage in deep exploits very often, but you can just see this player's betting numbers here. When this player has been in position, they've bet every single time. It's only three opportunities, but it's not. I'm not exploiting this. It's just worth keeping in mind. This player bet the only time that they were out of position. This player bet when check 2 has been 100% here, and so this player, generally speaking, has been active. I mean, this player we described as an active bettor, and this player is betting now. Okay, so we've got a polarized range from an active bettor who's like fairly aggressive, and we make what I consider a pretty standard call, but I want to keep everything in mind. Okay, and we get to the river, and we face a half pot bet, and this is very interesting in terms of morphology. So again, morphology just refers to range construction. Generally speaking, what I mean is we have 3 basic range constructions or morphologies. What are the 3? The 3 would be polar, linear, and merged. So polar refers to kind of like the top and bottom, ace deuce and 7 deuce, for example. Or sorry, pocket aces and ace deuce. or pocket kings and king deuce, right? So that would be like an example of a polarized range. You have the nuts, or you have a really crappy bluff. Okay. A linear range is just like aces, kings, queens, king, queen suited, queen, jack suited, jack 10 suited, all the way down. Okay. So when we have a polarized construction, we're talking about the nuts are air. I'm actually going to just give you a quick example here. Let's just give you guys a quick visual here. So this is an example of a polarized range. Okay, so we've got the nuts up here, and we've got bluffs down here. Okay, this would be an example of a linear range. We would just move out linearly. We just keep adding the best hands incrementally. Okay, so this is a linear range. This is a linear range. This is a linear range. This is also a linear range. This is also a linear range. Okay, we're just moving out in a linear way. We're moving. We start with the best hand, then the second best hand, then the third best, then the fourth best, then the fifth best, etc. Right, linearly moving across the tree, as opposed to like starting from the top and the bottom. Okay, so that's polar and linear. And merge just means we have some kind of combination of, to some extent, of this, where we're bluffing with like some of these medium strength hands like this. Might be bluffing with some of this potentially. We have maybe a little bit of a polarized component to it. Something like this is more of a merged range. Okay, and so what that would mean on the turn here is that would mean bluffing with like a pair of fives or a pair of deuces, for example. And in multi-way pots, generally speaking, you see more of this behavior than the metagame currently engages in. Okay, so we get to the river here, and this should be a very polarized betting scenario because the draws is blanked. My opponent was polarized on the turn. They bet 3/4 pot on the turn. Certainly this range is like king x plus in my opinion. The board has blanked. So the king x value component here, the king x plus value component, really I think it's probably king jack plus that this player arrives with, should probably be betting somewhat large. Potentially even slamming, like not all the time, but the 3/4 pot bet is, it suggests quite a lot of strength. And again, this board has blanked. So I would imagine if this player has deuces here, pocket fives, those are the hands that are the strongest in this player's range. This player can't really have pocket kings or pocket queens for flatting pre-flop, I don't think. Even though this player is short, I just don't believe that those hands are likely. Even if this player did have a trap like pocket aces or something, which I don't really think is credible. But if this player did have a hand like pocket aces, I think that hand should probably be betting larger than half pot on this river, unblocking the king x component. So this is my attempt to exploit the morphology that I'm observing here. This should be a polarized range. The value bets here should be sets like deuces, fives, value bets like king, queen, and if you're trapping, pocket aces. I don't see any other hands that are really credible value bets at the top of the curve in this scenario. The only way that this bet really makes sense is this player has like king jack or something, or king 10, and they think they're value betting really thinly. Alternatively, this could be a bet size that makes a lot of sense with bluffs. So what I have now, if we take our information together, what we have is a morphology that doesn't really make sense. This looks to be now like a thin value bet when that shouldn't be possible, really, unless this range is like dead to rights king jack or king 10 or something, and we're kind of like nailing the hand at this point. This bet size only really makes sense, I think, for king jack or king 10. We have a player profile where this player really likes to bet and really doesn't like to check. Obviously, it's a very small sample, and I don't want to make a decision off of a sample that's this inconsequential. But it just reinforces the thesis that I already have, that this bet size is incongruent with the value component of this player's range. As a result of that incongruence, I jammed. And I don't do this type of behavior. I don't engage in this type of behavior very often. I've streamed a lot. A lot of people have observed me streaming. It's very public. You can watch my streams on YouTube. So I think that it goes without saying that this is me engaging in exploitative behavior because I don't behave this way very often. And so this is an opportunity that I decided to take advantage of, where the value component of this player's range was too inconsistent. And in this type of a scenario where my range is uncapped and I still credibly represent value bets, because I think I would still call this bet on the turn uncapped. I think I could call this bet here with king queen. I don't think I'm forced to raise. I think I could call here with king 5. I think I could call here with king deuce. I think I could call here with pocket fives, with deuces. I think I could call here with even 5 deuce. So I think that my range here on the turn here is quite uncapped. I think I could call with king 7. I may potentially fold a hand like queen 7, but it's possible I call with queen 7 of diamonds. So I think I have an uncapped range with a lot of value bets present. So I can credibly, tell a narrative that I have the nuts. This player, I think, is going to have a difficult time hero calling what I think their range is most dense, which is probably King Jack or King 10. There are no obvious traps in this range because the obvious trap might be a hand like Pocket Kings, I suppose, but he flatted pre-flop, so that seems very unlikely. So again, we jammed. And we did get the fold. So this is an example of exploitative behavior by me. Just because I'm a very theoretically oriented player does not mean I don't exploit people. It just means that I'm careful about how I do it and try to be intelligent about how I do it. Okay, and with that, we can move back to the presentation. And we're now going to go over common mistakes. So common mistakes that people make when they're attempting to exploit is basically sloppiness, but we're going to cover that in a little bit of depth. So basically, people are really eager, in my opinion, to disrupt or ruin a solid and tested strategy by attempting to exploit someone based on insufficient information or data. So that goes to basically what I'm trying to say is we have solvers. We use solvers. They spit out very, very good strategies. And in fact, when people accuse people of cheating when they're playing No Limit Hold'em, the most common accusation around cheating is that you're using some kind of software to do it. Okay, most people don't assume people are cheating with like whole card sharing or kind of the more primitive means of cheating a long time ago. The most commonly held accusation, I think, when people think other players are cheating is like you're using some kind of third-party software to enhance your strategy. Okay, so if that's the case, if that's how we define cheating, and disrupting everything you've learned about how to do that, off the tables, so solid study work that's legitimate, disrupting and ruining all of that work by attempting to exploit someone without sufficient information or data is terrible. Okay, and I think that people do this all the time. Having insufficient understanding of what a sound strategy is. So as you guys could tell from my example, I had to know I knew a lot about how that spot was likely to work. I knew a lot about the morphology that would be appropriate. I knew a lot about the range, same thing, range construction that would be appropriate. I knew a lot about how multi-way pots work. I knew a lot about what bet sizing strategies are appropriate in multi-way pots. I also know that the metagame, because they're difficult scenarios to study, I also know that the metagame plays very poorly in multi-way pots. So I attacked in a situation where I was likely to be on firm ground. Okay, so you do have to know what a good strategy looks like to exploit a bad one, right? In order to readily identify a bad strategy, you have to know what a good strategy is. Okay. I think another common mistake is people attack ranges that are too strong. They just lose sight of the fact that their opponent's range is just has too many value bets, is too credible, and then they punt. Basically, it happens all the time. Attacking ranges without any credible threats to represent. This is actually really common. So this happens all the time. So people figure out that their opponent is weak. Okay, so this is one of the most common mistakes, actually. So people correctly identify or diagnose a weak range, and then the natural follow-up to that is that they're going to attack it. And the issue arises when they don't have any credible threats to represent. So the issue arises when they also have a capped range. So for example, if your opponent checks and you check, and your opponent checks and you check, and then your opponent bets really small, he's weak. But so are you. So raising the river with too weak of a range is a very dangerous thing to do because you're not representing anything either, right? So you want to keep that in mind, that you can only really attack a range, or it's only really safe to attack a range if you actually have credible value bets to represent. So in our example, I had credible value bets. I was still uncapped. Okay, I believe that I called the turn with all of the strongest hands, which gave me a lot of credible threats to represent, and so I was able to engage in my exploit, right? So you want to make sure that you actually have credible threats to represent before you go ahead and start down the rabbit hole. The other one is trying to be too cute with their exploits. People tend to think that people just tend to use exploiting as an excuse to fold too often when the price is too attractive or the potential bluff to value ratio is just too high. So people, they'll give themselves some narrative like people don't triple barrel bluff or something. And then they'll fold when the triple barrel is like the half pot or when the triple barrel is like to a third pot. And even if the narrative is true, like the odds are just so good that it's really difficult to fold. And it can be a really big mistake. So I think that people use, again, flimsy exploits, because if it's a deep exploit, if you know that your opponent has the nuts, you can fold. But they use flimsy evidence or like flimsy metagame reads, in my opinion, to fold when the bluff to value ratio is still too high or the price is just too attractive. Okay, so the next one is using inappropriate bet sizing when attacking various morphologies. So, for example, in that last in the example where I jammed the 8-4 of diamonds, I think that my opponent's most likely value bet, if my opponent is value betting, is king jack or king 10. That's not a range that I want to min raise into, right? I want to jam because I want to make king jack or king 10, which is potentially the top of my opponent's value betting range if my handicapping of that range is correct. I want to make that hand even fold, okay? So I want it to jam. If my opponent's range was dense, the nuts or air, the correct raise size would be very, very small, because if I thought my opponent had too many bluffs, but if they didn't have a bluff, they had the first nuts, I would just click it back, right? Because if they have a bluff, they'll fold to a click, and if they have the first nuts, they're never going to fold no matter how big my bet size. So people frequently use inappropriate bet size when attacking various morphologies, right? So they bet too big into a polarized range, or they bet too small into a more linear or capped one. Okay, very common. People often capture insufficient value by betting too small. They usually do this when they're trying to force their opponent to call. So they think that their opponent's got like a linear, but like maybe a weak range or maybe a capped range, and they really want, with their value bets, they really want to try to get called, and so they make this really small bet, and that actually destroys the EV of the hand if you understand the mathematics of betting. Betting bigger and getting called slightly less frequently is just more economic than betting smaller and trying to get called more often. So people very often use exploitative reasoning to play poorly, and that's one of the most common ways that people do it. And then recency bias is, I would say, when people actually engage in really true exploitative behavior and they really think they know what's going on. This is where they get confused the most. So they place the most emphasis on the present street, or what just happened, and they ignore or undervalue information from prior streets. And so, as you could tell from the hand example that we went through, the most important street was actually the turn and not the river, because the turn set up my opponent's range construction for the river. The turn gave my opponent a polarized range, and that opened up the opportunity to exploit on the river. Oftentimes, what will happen is they'll get to students or players I'm coaching will get to the river having seen big bets and then small bet or maybe medium bet and then a bet that's kind of difficult to make and likely to be a value bet, and then they get to the river, then their opponent bets small, and then the student tries to be aggressive and jam or try to exploit the small size on the river or something, and they're overvaluing the final street, and they're losing sight of the fact that on the previous streets their range might have been too strong. And sometimes you can run into these situations where your opponent's range is so dense value bets, that's why he's betting small. So your opponent's betting small because they think that they're just short bluffs. And then if you attack that range, you're going to destroy a lot of EV because you're basically making two mistakes at once. You've got recency bias, and then you're attacking a range that's too strong, which we've also talked about. So, those are some of the mistakes that I think people make that are basically disastrous and kind of destroy a lot of EV. And these are just some of the things that I like to consider when I think about exploiting people. So whenever I engage in an exploit, you're going to become vulnerable yourself, not only to your opponent's counter exploits, but also to your opponent's just playing a reasonable strategy, right? So sometimes people think that if they try to exploit someone and they're wrong, well, the other guy's not going to exploit him back, right? The problem is that they don't need to. If I'm playing my ABC solid strategy and you engage in exploitative behavior, you're playing poorly against a normal solid strategy. So you have to be right that an exploit exists. If you're wrong and your opponent's just playing well, you'll still lose money. I don't need to counter exploit you for your exploit to cause you losses. I just need to play a normal strategy. So you really want to have a deep conviction that your exploit is correct before you go ahead and engage. You want to keep in mind that most irrational plays can be justified, and reads are difficult to prove wrong. So for example, if I have a student and he open jams 7-2 offsuit for 20 big blinds on the button because the student believes everyone folds ace-queen offsuit and below pre-flop, what am I supposed to say? I mean, if that student is right that everyone folds ace-queen offsuit and below before the flop to a shove, Shoving 7-2 offsuit is profitable. But for me to actually prove that those two players at the time the hand was jammed aren't doing that is quite difficult, right? So the onus is on the exploit to be sufficiently justified. It's not on me to prove that your exploit sucks. It's on you to prove that your exploit is sufficiently justified by data and reasoning to deviate from a solid GTO-based play, right? So it's not on the GTO strategy to convince you that the exploit sucks. It's on the exploit to convince you that the GTO strategy will be inferior, okay? So always remember that. And the risks to being incorrect about an exploit rise the more frequently you engage in it. So this occurs for various reasons. So the more you attack someone with an exploit, obviously the greater the probability that they counter-exploit you. You can think about someone who folds too much to c-bets. If you c-bet 100% of the time over an infinity sample, they're going to change their behavior, right? So there's counter-exploits. There's generally a deteriorating equity profile the more you attack someone. So if someone folds too much from the big blind, for example, we start by opening offsuit 8s, but if someone folds too much, maybe we open offsuit 7s pure from the button. Then we can maybe open offsuit 6s, but as we continue to exploit them, we're moving down to worse and worse hands. So we're moving from offsuit 6x hands to offsuit 5x hands to offsuit 4x hands to offsuit 3x hands, and the hands are getting worse and worse. So because the hands are getting worse, if our opponent is actually playing reasonably well or playing back at us, we're going to lose more and more money the more we attack them, right? Because the hands are getting worse. And alternatively, even if we can attack profitably here, we might be missing opportunity costs in other parts of the tree. So again, if someone folds too much to c-bets and you start c-betting more and more aggressively, well, if you start c-betting hands like middle pair, when you would normally check those hands, you're missing the opportunity to catch their bluffs on later streets. So that's an example of missed opportunity costs that you also want to try to take into account. Okay. So with that, we're basically out of time, and this is the end of the presentation. So I hope that this was really valuable for you guys. I hope you guys got a lot out of it. I hope that this gave you something to think about when it comes to engaging in exploits, and I appreciate all of your time. So thank you very much, and make sure you think about BBZ Poker when you're looking to learn No Limit. Thank you guys, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.